When I was in high school and then in undergraduate university, I had a typical range of part-time jobs. I did a tiny little bit of sort of handiwork or gardening type work, but my two main jobs were firstly working at a donut store and then working at an electronics store. But during the early years of undergraduate university, I also did what many people do, which was tutored high school students in subjects like mathematics and physics. And in the second year of university, during one semester, I'd finished my exams a little bit earlier than some of my colleagues, and so I was sort of twiddling my thumbs. And an idea I'd been playing with was to write a maths textbook that sort of very informally and conversationally laid out the explanations I'd been refining in teaching intermediate senior high school mathematics. So I sat down, spent sort of some time, it wasn't a huge amount of time, and came up with an informal textbook. It was about 130 pages long, so relatively short, and then sort of thought, okay, what do I do now? And so I thought, well, I could make it into a proper book. And so I went and talked to some local printeries associated with universities. I also talked to some actual professional print publishing houses. I know I was laughed out of at least one of those. And in the end, with my university's commercial press, I worked with them and they took me through some of the ins and outs of professional publishing. And I gathered together some money and I printed a run of, I think, 40 of these books. And I think at the time, 40 of the books cost about $400, so about $10 a book. Then again, without really planning or thinking this too much, I went into one of my local Dymocks bookstores and asked to speak to the manager. I may have phoned beforehand, I can't remember. And Dean, the manager, came out and was surprisingly friendly. I was very, very nervous. I was 18 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. And he explained the consignment system, whereas you basically give them some books, they don't give you any money, and if they sell the books, they will then pay you at an agreed upon rate. And at that time, I think the percentage that the store would take was something like 45 or 50% initially. Although I think I later negotiated this down to 30% in some cases. So they gave me a shot. And in parallel with that, I thought, oh, this is really exciting. And so I wrote to the very local provincial newspaper at the time and said, hey, this is what I'm doing, I'm really excited. And they did a small article on it. So a few days later, I get an excited call, I think, from the manager of the bookstore saying, hey, we've sold out of your book. Now, one thing to remember is this is at the lead up to Christmas time. My parents, who were incredibly supportive my entire life, were skeptical of the timing of this. But the book sold out, so I had to scramble to get some more printed, and some of this, I think, ran into the next year. So we printed a larger print run. I can't remember if I did another 40, but I think it might have been another 100. And then it kept selling out. We kept getting more and more publicity at a higher level. We sold 200, 300, and after a few of these iterations, we were selling them in print runs of 1,000 books at a time. And in those small number of bookstores, because we'd expanded by that stage, we were outselling Harry Potter at the time, which was an absolutely incredible achievement to think of in retrospect. Obviously not across all bookstores. So to make all of this happen, I had to learn a whole bunch of skills on the fly. I had to learn how to create professional looking books, the print production process, CMYK colors, print ready PDFs, all that sort of stuff. And that was a lot harder back then, especially for someone who had no idea. So I was very grateful to, for example, the printers at the time who took me through some of these steps very patiently. I also had to learn how to write press releases and approach journalists. Again, I'm familiar with that now, but it was a very alien process at the time. Had to learn how to, later on as we started advertising, write copywriting, write compelling advertisements. Had to learn budgeting, had to learn the logistics of shipping books around Australia, had to create an online website and sales portal so people could order the books and then work out the most cost-effective way to get the books out to individuals all around Australia at the time. And then eventually we ended up, later books that we were producing, we ended up having to learn and talk to international printers, get print production done overseas, learn all sorts of interesting things like marine freight and insuring marine freight at 110%, and all of these other wonderful learning experiences, which are really daunting and confronting at the time, but were fantastic things to learn in retrospect. And it really kickstarted my life of combining education and outreach and entrepreneurial type activity. So we did a series of books since then. We have a company called Math Thrills that does educational books specifically in the technical area around AI, robotics, and autonomous vehicles, and I've continued and loved doing this sort of activity to the current day. Now, there are a lot of learnings along the way. Some of these are in hindsight and some of the things that became apparent very quickly at the time. So in hindsight, the obvious thing is that, first of all, I was in a privileged position to be able to do this. I was in a position where I didn't have to work 40 or 50 hours a week as soon as I finished university in order to support myself. I could afford to expend some time on doing this, and I could use some of my very hard earned and hard saved money to put into that initial print run. But even spending $400 back then, and you can probably multiply these numbers by 2 or 3 to get them in today's numbers, it was a big deal for me even at the time, and so I was pretty nervous about it. The second obvious realization, and again this is mostly in retrospect, is that it was dependent on the generosity and support and risk-taking of others. So to have the owners of the bookstores take a risk on me just walking in off the street, sensing my enthusiasm but also my inexperience, and explaining how it works, not really exploiting or taking advantage of me, and then sharing my excitement as sales went through the roof, that was a pivotal part of it. I had help from parents of friends in terms of advice from journalists and people who'd done marketing before, who gave me lots of really valuable advice on how to go about marketing and promoting the book. I also had the support, of course, of my parents and my family and my friends, and so that was also fantastic as well. And without any of that, or without all of that, it would have been much harder to pull off. A third realization was the huge financial benefit of having some sort of side gig or side hustle relatively early on in your career. So extra money is always useful, but in general terms, $1 extra at age 18 is generally much more useful than $1 extra at age 28 or age 38. Obviously, there's always many, many exceptions, but as a general trend. And it can enable you to, for example, avoid going into debt for purchases, including some quite significant purchases, which means you avoid paying interest, which means you end up further and further financially ahead. And so there's this whole compounding effect whereby earning a significant amount of money very early on in your life can be the equivalent of earning millions of dollars, many millions of dollars later on in your life. And that was something that I only came to appreciate, I think, a little bit later in the piece. An additional realization was doing this initiative, which again wasn't particularly planned, was fantastic material for things like job interviews, scholarship interviews, and prize interviews. And I know that I was able to in part land some internships or very prestigious work experience programs, in part because the interviewers were really, really impressed with the initiative that I took in going down this road. Of course, there was luck involved as well, but it was something that I could talk about in interviews. It was something that very much differentiated me from my peers who were amazing academically, but perhaps didn't have that extra experience or adventures in this area. I mentioned already earlier in the video that I learnt a huge amount of soft skills along the way in order to make this work. One of the things I learnt in doing this was that in most cases, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so there was no point over optimizing for some particular tiny component of this whole business proposition in educational publishing. You had to make sure you covered all the links. And so I was perhaps probably better at writing the textbook than I was at approaching journalists or marketing it, but I had to make sure that I was at least competent across all of these different areas. And without being competent across all of these areas, it would have been really a big struggle. I also learned a really valuable lesson about financials. And so I did, once this thing got going, I did all the theoretical numbers on paper of the profit margins and all those sort of things, and discovered many, many times over that what you plan on paper never comes true in practice. And usually the profit margin, the profitability of something ends up being far less than you predicted. So I learned from that, in terms of any financially motivated venture, you need to bake in really significant margins, because those margins are going to be eroded by all sorts of both predicted but mostly unpredicted changes to how it actually unfolds in practice. And one of the ways I was able to do this was to be able to negotiate and scale up production. And so at one stage I was able to get the cost price of a book down from, say, $10 per item to $3 maybe, or $4 per item. And that made a huge difference. It made meant my profit per book went up by a large multiple, and that was really, really significant. Another unexpected but very pleasant surprise from doing this was it was extremely fulfilling. So along with orders, we got hundreds of letters in the mail, because it wasn't just email, it was physical letters, snail mail, so to speak. And people were thanking us. They were talking about how transformative the book was. Of course, not everyone loved the book, but we got so many really heartwarming stories of how this had changed someone's educational journey. And that was incredibly rewarding and fulfilling. And that's been a really key motivation of all the work I've done in this area since then. Another really surprising lesson was, at some point, despite this being so exhilarating and exciting, I could not stand the sight of it anymore. So at some point, many months in, maybe a year later, I could not stand the prospect of doing any more work on the book and promoting it or anything like that. And at that stage, I did an objective calculation, and I worked out I was probably earning on average about $200 for every hour of work I put into the initiative. So maybe $500 per hour in today's terms, which may not be much for a lawyer, but was a huge amount for an 18 or 19-year-old back then. But I got to the point where I just couldn't look at it anymore. And so I had to take a long break, and it was actually quite a while before I came back and looked at it again, and also started on my second book, which was a physics book. And this really plays to the whole "don't kill what you love" statement, which is you can overdo it, especially if you combine something that you're passionate and excited about with a financial venture. Another lesson I learned was that creating a sensible, moderately profitable business is conceptually, in many ways, a very different proposition to the sort of 1,000 times multiplier startup plays that are predominant in tech areas, which is where I'm playing and interested at the moment. And I've found that the mindset that is really good or comfortable with one aspect of it is not necessarily very well suited to the other in both directions. And it's been, I guess, reassuring to find a lot of colleagues who are much more naturally good, sensible business owners or business proposers, and then there are people who are very good at the sort of 1,000 times scale up but very high risk plays. And that's something that I'm continuing to work on today in terms of bridging this conceptual divide. Obviously, profitability and revenue is a big part of startups as well, but the whole general conceptual approach does seem quite different to just creating a sensible, self-sustaining, mildly profitable business. The final thought I want to share is around what I knew at the time and what the degree of planning was. And so for people who've worked with me or particularly been mentored or supervised by me nowadays, know that I will go out of my way to try and plan and assess risks and risk mitigate and really assess the potential upside and downside of any significant initiative that we take on. But I know back then at the time, I wasn't thinking about any of this. I hadn't really thought about how to make it into a book when I was writing it. When I'd made the book, I hadn't really thought about how to get it into bookstores or market it or promote it. And so I was sort of just inventing it and making it up on the fly. It could have all gone horribly wrong. I was in a fortunate position to be able to persist at it for a while, and I was lucky that it worked really well. But it is something that I come back to periodically nowadays to remind myself that while planning and risk mitigation is very sensible and is a very key part of many things that we do, there is still a role for the occasional not particularly well thought out adventure or risk-taking exercise, and thinking too hard about the potential consequences is not always helpful, in part because you cannot predict all the potential consequences. My parents at the time did not predict that I would have a best-selling maths textbook at Christmas, and they were wrong. And I, to be honest, agreed with them partly, but I still went ahead and did it, and very unpredicted outcomes ensued. So planning and risk mitigation is really good, but at the same time, a little bit of adventure without thinking too much about the consequences, I think, is a really key part of any approach to life and careers.